In this episode, we're talking pretty candidly about race. Now, if you've stuck with us up to this point, you've definitely heard it come up more than once or twice. That's because race is at the root of this reparations conversation. It was the early ideas of race that allowed for the first harms against Black people, starting with the transatlantic slave trade. It was the exploitation of people based on race that created and maintained a massive imbalance in wealth and power. And it was the mechanism of systematic racism that defined centuries of race-based discrimination, both state-sanctioned and culturally enforced. So, across U.S. history, race has been a very powerful idea. Which is why we're talking with the scholar who has spent much of his career trying to address the effects of racism on U.S. society. Ibram X. Kendi is founding director of the Center for Antiracist Research and professor of history at Boston University. He's also a best-selling author of several books, including How to Be an Antiracist. And, as it turns out, Kendi has done a lot of thinking about race and reparations. In fact, he says, you can't deal with either issue without also addressing the other.
What I would ask for Americans who claim they're committed to racial equality and know the importance of wealth in opportunity within this system, how do you eliminate the growing racial wealth gap without a policy like reparations? It's impossible.
So I wanted to share the conversation we had in hopes of trying to address the underpinnings of America's so-called original sin. I'm Saraya Wintersmith. This is What Is Owed. So to start, you're approaching this conversation as a leading thinker on anti-racism and moving society towards greater equity. How is reparations a part of this concept?
For me, I don't know of another policy proposal that has the capacity to eliminate the racial wealth gap. Obviously, wealth is cumulative. If certain communities were denied access to jobs and wealth-building communities and others were given preferential treatment, at some point our nation has to acknowledge that history and make amends and repair the persisting disparities that exist.
To your point about the nation acknowledging its wrongs and trying to make good, we know that the United States has offered reparations at least twice before, once in the 1980s in response to Japanese internment, and then again through the National Indian Claims Commission. I'm curious, in your view, what lessons can we draw from those situations, and are they even fair or relevant models to consider when we think about the struggle for reparations for Black people?
I mean, certainly, I think there's similarities and distinctions. But I think the lessons that we can draw is that there's a precedent for the United States not only acknowledging its racial injustice, but also seeking to make amends financially.
It might surprise you to hear the U.S. has paid reparations before. In 1946, Congress formed the Indian Claims Commission as a way for indigenous tribes to raise their reparations claims with the U.S. government. Land claims were the main issue, as many tribes sought to get their land back, but the commission instead offered financial compensation. Several tribes also got the commission to reaffirm and enforce old treaties that the U.S. government had previously signed, dealing with territorial borders or other matters. By the time the commission ended in 1978, it had allocated over $800 million to settle more than 500 separate claims by tribal entities. Then there's the other time the U.S. ended up having to pay reparations. That time, it was to Japanese Americans.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens.
You're hearing Milton Eisenhower, brother of then General and later President Dwight Eisenhower. This clip is from a 1943 film. World War II was still raging at the time. And in it, he explains the government's justification to incarcerate Japanese people on American soil.
No one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
And this decision received overwhelming support. A poll from the time showed about 90% of Americans backed the internment of Japanese immigrants, and nearly 60% supported the removal of Japanese American citizens. The resulting imprisonment of more than 100,000 Japanese people in the U.S. caused them to lose hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. It would be almost 40 years before Congress would try to remedy that action in 1988, with the passing of the Civil Liberties Act. By 1992, the government had given checks to 80,000 living detainees, $20,000 each. Records from the time show that the total amounted to about $1.6 billion.
And so the question then becomes, why has the United States been willing to do it in those instances and not as a result of, and not in the instance of African Americans?
Professor Kendi, you're posing my exact next question. Why do you think it is that the government has been so resistant to offering reparations to Black people?
I think there's a number of different factors. I think those who are in positions of power, to a certain extent in both political parties, are opposed to reparations, whether because of their own racist ideas that the cause of economic racial inequality is the result of some deficiencies that Black people hold, or whether because that would hurt them politically with centrist voters or even some high-income Black voters. And so they don't have the political will or courage to support reparations. You know, I think the widespread racist idea that Black people are lazy, that Black people don't know how to save, that pretty much Black people are the cause of their own, economic plight, while simultaneously, when the government has seek to support, even in minor ways, that support wasn't necessarily justice as much as it was handouts being given to people who are undeserving. And so you even have some Black people who are like, I don't want any handouts, not knowing that they have consumed sort of racist propaganda to undermine efforts towards justice.
You're touching on a point now that I think lurks beneath this discussion. Reparations, I think, for folks who think about it a lot, it seems transformative because it does pay a debt, but it is also an attempt to get at our nation's social hierarchy, which was built largely on white supremacy. And for anyone who disputes that, we're tracking this idea through U.S. policy, starting with slavery and the constitutional 3/5 clause, and then legally sanctioned and socially acceptable racism. So how do you get Black reparations out of a country that's built on that concept?
Well, I think through organizing and through people who are committed to justice, being in positions of power, or even creating similar conditions that ultimately led this nation to end chattel slavery, even as it was built, on chattel slavery conditions.
When Kendi refers to the end of chattel slavery, he's teasing out this important detail from when President Abraham Lincoln famously signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. You probably know that the Declaration granted freedom to all enslaved people in areas rebelling against the Union, aka the Confederacy. And what Kendi is calling attention to is the political landscape that led to Lincoln's decision, namely that he was 3 years into fighting the Southern states in the Civil War, and the Union wasn't exactly winning.
Abraham Lincoln's administration realized that the only way to save the Union in the United States was through eliminating slavery. And he tried every which way to propose the support of slavery where it existed. But enslavers rejected that. They either wanted the Lincoln administration to allow for the extension of slavery, which for them would allow for the persisting life of slavery.
But when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Kendi points out the document allowed for the acceptance of those newly freed people into the Union Army. This meant more soldiers and a moral cause to bolster war efforts.
So even the Lincoln administration, when it decided to engage in the Emancipation Proclamation, it wasn't necessarily because of a justice or even commitment to the freedom of Black people, as much as Lincoln needed troops to win the Civil War, Black troops. So whether it's people who are committed to justice, to anti-racism, to creating equality, or conditions that more or less force those in positions of power to provide reparations to Black Americans, that's how we'll one day get there.
But Kendi also immediately points out what's in the way.
And I'll also just add very quickly, you have many white Americans who imagine that providing African Americans reparations is literally taking money out of their bank accounts. And so they resist it as if that's what would happen. You also have white Americans who would say that why are, quote, they having to pay for something that they, quote, didn't do, completely, again, rejecting their own knowledge that wealth is cumulative. And that's some of the reason for them having 10 times more wealth than Black Americans isn't just what their generation did or what they did, but also the wealth that has been passed on as a result of the history of racism.
And to that point, if there are some portion of white Americans viewing reparations as a zero-sum game, but there also are, we have to assume, some portion that want to be anti-racist and move along the struggle for reparations. How are white people a part of that conversation? What's their role?
I think that the role of white Americans is hopefully to be honest about the past, that slavery was literally a system of exploitation, the transfer of resources and wealth from enslaved people to enslavers and the many collateral business persons. That Jim Crow too was literally a system that allowed for the hyper exploitation of Black people and the transfer, of wealth. And so to support reparations today is to not only acknowledge that history, but want to remedy it. And it's also to recognize that these zero-sum ideas, are false. White Americans are not going to lose, and typically do not lose, when Black people gain. If anything, white Americans are going to gain, from having a society that's more equitable.
I want to play some tape for you now. The concern that the zero-sum game will lead some portion of white America to build up resentment is one that we've heard, as my partner and I have been working across this podcast. And I want to play this tape from William Sandy Darity, the economist at Duke University. Just so you know, this clip is from an earlier episode where we talked about the possibility of violence after reparations.
We have a tradition of armed violence on the part of disgruntled whites in the United States, directed at Black Americans. And so I think, unfortunately, that is a potential chain of events that could take place in the aftermath of the adoption of a reparations plan on the part of a minority of whites in the United States, but a dangerous minority. And so I've consistently said this is a prospect that would have to be anticipated at the point in which serious consideration is being given to reparations, and preparation should be made to prevent that from taking place.
Ibram Kendi, what do you make of this concern?
I mean, I think it's a valid concern. I think those who oppose reparations will likely spread lies to white Americans, to their constituents, to their readers and viewers, that, quote unquote, those who are providing reparations to Black people are stealing and taking money from white people to do so. They're going to take all the money you had that you worked hard for and just give it to Black people who don't deserve it, who are lazy, who's going to just spendthrift. Like, that obviously is going to create resentment, and that resentment's going to almost certainly turn into violence. And so I think that that certainly has to be anticipated. I agree with Professor Derry, and I think one of the ways we can do so is to talk about the fact that we have, for instance, a tax code that allows wealthy individuals and corporations to literally not have to pay taxes. But nobody characterizes their ability to avoid taxes as literally stealing from white people or stealing, from Americans. People normalize that. And I think there are a number of different ways in which we can pay for reparations. And I think that that conversation about how we're paying for reparations needs to be a part of the sort of narrative around it to push back against the almost certain lies that it's being paid for through robbing white Americans.
I want to stay with this idea for a little bit, just because I know that it didn't come up for me until I started working on this project, and maybe it should, but you're such a scholarly person. It sounds like you are making something of the idea that there could be violent backlash if the U.S. government ever got to a place where it was willing to give reparations to Black people. Do you have any ideas about what we should do in preparation of that possible outcome?
So I think, again, I think part of it is defending against the narratives that will generate that backlash through putting forth an affirmative narrative as to what reparations is, why it's happening, and where the money is coming from. But I also think if we were to be in a nation that was seriously considering reparations, and we literally had the power to do so, hopefully we will also be thinking about radically transforming the gun culture in this country and making it much, much harder for people to purchase, assault rifles. And, hopefully it will be combined with significant media and educational programs that allow particularly white Americans to realize that the zero-sum theory, is a lie, and that every time the United States has moved to provide civil and voting rights and even economic opportunity for Black Americans, that it's actually benefited white people too. And so I think all of that sort of has to be paired, I think, with a serious reparations program.
We'll hear more from Dr. Kendi after the break. When we talk about reparations, we are often talking about cash payments, but we've heard that the real goal in doing a reparations program could be repairing the country and healing centuries of harm. I wonder, in your view, how important is that aspect, the healing aspect, to reparations?
It's an important part, and because certainly Black Americans have not just been subjected to all sorts of racist exploitation, but we've also been faced with all sorts of trauma as a result of this history of racism and dispossession and extraction. And certainly providing people with money is helpful, but it's not total, in their healing.
What do you think would be the most essential part in developing sort of a national plan to move towards healing?
So to me, I think that I would imagine three different components. I would say first, deconstructing this structure of racism, which exists through a whole host of policies and practices that are maintaining racial disparities and inequities. And those disparities and inequities are literally harming people. And replacing those with equitable and anti-racist policies and practices that can heal people, that can heal communities, that can heal neighborhoods. Secondly, creating an educational system and even a media culture that is based on actively teaching young and old people about racial equality, that no racial group is superior or inferior, that there's nothing wrong or even right about any racial group. And I think that being African Americans, being able to live for the first time in a nation that doesn't make all sorts of judgments about them because of the color of their skin, in which they can sort of see their culture and their way of life affirmed, for the first time, will be healing. And finally, creating true safety for African Americans for the first time, in which we no longer have to fear racist violence, whether through vigilantes or police officers.
And if you were to let your imagination run wild, or if you had a magic wand and you could conjure up real examples of what those 3 points you just described look like, what would they be?
First, I think that creating a sort of a Medicare for all program in which everyone has access to free healthcare, combined with creating hospitals and medical facilities of high grade, in every community in this country, so that there are no more trauma deserts. There are no more situations in which people are driving by certain hospitals because they know they are harmful, in which everyone, no matter in which Black people who are most likely to have to live in trauma deserts or receive sort of subpar care, will receive high quality care in their communities as would other Americans. And secondly, creating an educational system which is, let's say, similar to Germany, where kids in Germany learn about the Holocaust beginning in kindergarten. And our children systematically begin learning about slavery and racism in kindergarten and continue to learn about it and what it means to be anti-racist in each grade in developmentally appropriate forms. And then finally, creating a society where people don't have access to assault rifles. And we don't try to, quote, reduce or eliminate crime by more prisons and police, as much as we try to do that by thinking about the larger social conditions that are leading to people engaging in harm and violence.
And for my last question, I'm just curious, because I've read the introduction that you wrote for How to Be an Antiracist, and I know that you don't like revisiting that high school oratorical competition and where you were in your journey with, I guess, sort of regurgitating racist ideas to the approval of Black peers. Could you just describe your ideas about reparations and anti-racism over time? I'm absolutely certain that there must have been a journey from that point to where you are now on this issue.
When I was in high school, I can't even remember having any serious conversations about reparations, but I suspect if I did, I would have probably opposed it as like a, quote, a handout for Black people. But over time, as I started to realize that sort of racist propagandists created the construct of the handout to sort of cover up the fact that white Americans were primarily receiving preferential treatment from public and private sort of policies and practices, the more I learned that there was nothing wrong with Black people, and Black people deserved to receive justice for the harm that they have been subjected to over the course of history. When I also learned, particularly by the time I got to graduate school, that many of the most anti-racist thinkers and activists in history were major supporters of reparations, the more I realized that reparations as a policy program was essential to radically transforming this country.
And do you think that's a journey everyone can take?
I think so, because I have yet to come across someone who is knowledgeable about American history and about present racist policies and practices. And I've yet to come across someone who truly believes that there's nothing wrong and inferior about Black people. I've yet to come across somebody who believes that when things are taken from you, you should receive it back, who opposes reparations.
Professor Ibram Kendi, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you for having me.
It's hard to know how much of what Kendi says here applies to people in Boston. The city, presumably, is in a different place. I say that because in Boston, officials have already approved a task force and researchers to study the city's complicity in harming Black people. And so far, there's no major opposition. There are concerns, but the public complaints about the city's efforts haven't been coming from white people. On our next episode, our last episode, we take this conversation back to where we started, to Boston. And we're taking all the lessons we've learned back to the people in charge of the city's reparations effort, including task force members and Mayor Michelle Wu. What is Owed is a production of GBhnews. This episode was produced and written by our senior producer, Jerome Campbell, along with me, Saraya Wintersmith. Editing by Paul Singer. Production oversight by Lee Hill. Melee is our project manager, and managing producer for podcasting at GBH is Devin Maverick Robbins. Mixing and sound design by David Goodman and Gary Mott. Theme song and original music by Malik Williams. Artwork by Matt Welch and Mami Hawabawo. We love hearing from our listeners. Leave us a voicemail at 617-958-6061.
GBH.